My name is Jason Miller. Even as I write this story, I still get chills. Last year, I moved into a house I had long dreamed of. It was in a small, quiet town close to a big city. The townspeople were warm and friendly, especially my neighbors Paul and Karen. They lived right next door and welcomed me warmly on my first day. My house was on a quiet, peaceful street. After work, I usually sat in my backyard, reading a book or tending to my garden. The first few weeks passed without incident until I started hearing strange noises at night. One night, well past midnight, I was woken up by a faint scream coming from the house next door. At first, I thought I was dreaming. However, after waking up several more times that night to the same sound, I realized it was real. The next morning, I went to Paul and Karen's house and asked if everything was okay. Paul laughed and said, "Oh, Karen sometimes has frightening dreams at night." But Karen gave Paul a look that made me uneasy. As the nights went on, the noises increased. Not just screams, but it sounded like something heavy was being dragged across the floor. One night, I couldn't take it anymore and called the police. They came and checked the house but found nothing. When Paul and Karen saw the police, Paul said to me, somewhat angrily, "Don't worry, Jason. Everything is under control." However, a few days later, Karen approached me secretly. Her eyes were filled with tears and she whispered, "Help me." Shocked and scared, I asked what was wrong, but Paul intervened and pulled Karen inside. From that moment, every sound from their house disturbed me even more. One night, unable to bear it any longer, I quietly entered their yard and watched through a window. I saw Paul carrying something in the basement. The basement door closed, and strange noises started again. A few minutes later, Paul came upstairs and turned off the lights. The next day, I saw Karen at the market and tried to talk to her. Her eyes were still filled with tears, and she whispered, "In the basement." At that moment, I made my decision. Late that night, I saw Paul leaving. Seizing the opportunity, I entered the basement with Karen's help. The basement was dark and damp. As I searched around, I found a chained hatch on the floor. When I opened it, the sight was horrifying. A woman, chained and bloody, lay there. When I met Karen's terrified eyes, she whispered, "Paul's sister." She explained that Paul was mentally unstable and had kept his sister in the basement for years. I immediately called the police, and the woman was taken to the hospital. Paul was arrested, and Karen was taken to a safe place. The neighborhood was in shock after the incident. It was hard to believe Paul had managed to hide this for years. After this event, I returned to my home, but my peace was shattered. Every night, the face of the woman I found in the basement haunts me. If you ever hear strange noises from your neighbors, remember that it might not just be a nightmare. There might be someone waiting for help. Last year, a group of adventurous young friends and I decided to go camping in a forested area. I am one of the protagonists of this story, and my name is Lucas. Along with my friends Emma, Jake, and Alex, we were determined to explore the tranquility and beauty of nature deep within the forest. By the time we set up our campsite, the sun was already beginning to set. We sat around the fire, joking and having fun. Emma played the guitar by the campfire while Jake and Alex collected wood from the trees. However, after the sun set, the atmosphere of the forest changed. There was a tension in the air, as if nature was whispering to us that something was wrong. As the night went on, the silence around us became more pronounced. Not a sound was heard, not even the birds. A sense of unease started to spread among my friends. We looked at each other in the light of the flames, our fear growing. Then we heard a faint rustling in the distance. At first, we ignored it, but the rustling grew closer and more distinct. Our hearts started to race. There was something approaching us in the forest, but we couldn't see what it was. We could only hear the strange sound coming from among the trees. Panicking, we tried to make the campfire bigger. However, the fire's light was not enough to illuminate our surroundings. Then we heard a growl coming from the depths of the forest. Emma's guitar strings suddenly snapped, and Jake and Alex stopped gathering wood and turned towards us. Our eyes widened as we looked at each other. This sound filled us with an inexplicable fear. For a moment, none of us could speak. We just listened to the silence of the forest. Then, we heard a strange whistling sound from afar. It was approaching us, like a melody mixed with the wind. It sent shivers down our spines because this whistle didn't sound human. It was more like the forest itself was speaking in its own language. Jake muttered, "What is that?" We huddled closer around the fire, clutching our arms tightly. Emma put down her guitar and began to watch the surroundings nervously, biting her lips. Alex quietly readied a stick, looking around with a worried expression. At that moment, a shadow appeared from the dark depths of the forest. But this was no ordinary shadow. This creature, thin and skeletal, glided through the trees towards us. It was like a terrifying apparition seen in the dark. Our hearts pounded and our eyes widened. As this horrifying entity approached us, it began to envelop us in darkness. Emma's guitar fell silently to the ground, and Jake and Alex swung their sticks with trembling hands. Just then, an unexpected scream echoed from one corner of the campsite. We all turned at once and saw a man running towards us. There was a wild expression on his face. Our eyes widened and our breath caught. This man looked like the killer in the campsite. "Run!" Jake shouted, and we all froze for a moment. Then, before we knew what was happening, we started running. Behind us, we could hear the madman's groans and the growls of the dark entity. Our hearts raced, and no matter how fast we ran, it felt like the dark danger approaching us was inescapable. Finally, when we emerged from the forest, we were out of breath. We kept running without looking back, escaping the dark depths of the forest. However, it would be impossible to forget the terrifying experiences of that night. Perhaps the legends about people mysteriously disappearing in the forest were true, and we had miraculously survived. My name is Alexander. The story I'm about to tell you is about a terrifying event that happened to me while I was working at a gas station. That night started like any other ordinary night, but everything quickly turned into a nightmare. The wind was blowing around the station with a faint wail. The branches of the trees swayed with the light breeze, and the leaves rustled, dancing on the ground. The distant sound of car engines filled the empty silence of the night. Inside the station, the faint sound of the television could be heard, accompanied by a slight crackling. The refrigerator behind the counter occasionally made a low humming noise. As the wind blew harder, the station's lights flickered dimly and then suddenly went out. My heart started to race because I couldn't see anything in this sudden darkness. Was it a malfunction, or had darker forces come into play? I tried to adjust my eyes, but all around me was just intense darkness. I waited for the lights to come back on, but they didn't. It was still dark, and I was trying to understand what was happening. At that moment, a car approached from outside and pulled into the station. The car's headlights pierced through the darkness, casting light inside. Seeing a customer arriving was reassuring because it would help distract me for a moment. The man who got out of the car had a tired expression on his face. As he approached step by step, he was muttering something rapidly. Although I couldn't hear exactly what he was saying, it was clear he was in a hurry. He headed towards the pump to fill up with gas. Just then, the station's lights suddenly came back on, and I felt relieved. But this relief was short-lived because when I turned my eyes to the man's back, the sight left me frozen. Next to the car, an indistinct shadow appeared and started approaching us step by step. The man seemed unaware, but I couldn't take my eyes off it. My heart began to race, and I had difficulty breathing. The entity slowly approached the man from behind and disappeared. I stood there like a frozen statue, in shock. The man acted as if he hadn't noticed anything, but I knew something was wrong. After pulling myself together, I asked the customer if he had seen the entity, but he said he hadn't seen anything and mentioned that he was very tired as he headed back to his car. His response somewhat eased my mind, but I still had an unease inside me. However, the terrifying memories of that night would stay in my mind for a long time. The silence of the station would always remind me of this tense moment I experienced.